say hey.
Yeah, before I forget, you can feel free to take one of these. This has been my motto since I found out about my brain tumor. It's a magnet, but so you can take one if you know somebody that's going through something. Yeah. So, hi, my name is Rebecca Shingeldecker, and I'm so honored and humbled to be asked to talk to y'all. I'm a wife of 30 years to the most amazing man I've ever known, the love of my life since I was barely 15. I am mom to 2 grown kids, Layla and Zachary, plus his beautiful South African wife, our bonus daughter, Nikita. And I'm grandma to the beautiful Sutton that our daughter gave us in December 2020. I'm a brain tumor warrior and 2-time brain injury survivor with post-concussion syndrome, a professional CrossFit Games athlete, and much more. But most of all, I am a chosen daughter of the King, a child of God, and when it comes down to it, that's the only thing that defines me. That's eternal, and I cling to that promise. My journey into the Broken Brain Society began in March 2018. I was fit and healthy, but over the course of 2 weeks, I had 4 stroke-like headaches. March 14th, our daughter's birthday, and the day I got my CrossFit coaching certificate in the mail, I was diagnosed with a golf ball-sized brain tumor sitting on my frontal lobe, also known as, on the motor control center, which is also the strength center of my brain. The placement of this tumor was beyond ironic because I had relied on my strength to get me through everything. I've always been an extremely strong-willed, stubborn redhead, and that day I decided to fight that darn tumor with everything I had and would show it who was boss. And to say I was naive would be a severe understatement. I truly had zero clue what awaited me. God sure has a way of reminding us where our true strength really lies, doesn't he? And spoiler alert, it's not in anything you or I possess. That uninvited intruder was removed 16 days after it was discovered, not ironically in my opinion, on Good Friday, March 30th, 2018, and her husband's birthday. So on Easter Sunday, I woke up completely paralyzed in my right leg with severe loss of strength in my right arm. After 6 days in the ICU and more steroids through my central line than one person should have, I went to inpatient rehab where I learned to walk again with the aid of a walker. Mind you, the day prior to surgery, I was slinging a lot of weight over my head, squatting, picking it up, etc. in CrossFit. So the stark contrast in my physical strength and ability was stunning and humbling. This was followed by about 6 weeks of outpatient day neuro rehab every day, all day, and then on to ongoing traditional rehab. 6 months into rehab, I was in a car accident that gave me concussion number 1. And then 6 months after that, 1 year after surgery, my right-sided weakness struck and I dropped a 65-pound barbell on my head. And that was brain injury number 3, the trifecta. Throughout the diagnosis, surgery, and rehab and subsequent injuries, by my side was my husband Roger, the person I've been with since I barely turned 15, and the one I married April 11th, 1992. The spring break of my sophomore year of high school. He was always my ride or die, my faithful caretaker, the one I never questioned would always be there no matter what. With a 3rd brain injury, everything compounded and magnified all the symptoms that up until that point might have been improving. It really turned me from an extreme extrovert who loved being with people to someone who had to be cautious about what I agreed to doing. My husband had always been more of a homebody, so this switch served to bring us even closer. He excelled in his role as what I called my brain gatekeeper, caretaker. He was the only one who understood my brain issues and how they affected me. He looked out for me and often protected me from myself when I would make plans that he knew wouldn't be good for me, or he would know where I needed to sit in a place that had speakers and so many other things. As you're probably very well aware, living with brain injuries can often be quite the isolating experience. However, I always knew that in him I had someone that would be there, and when no one else understood, he did. When I cried to him because I no longer had the intelligence I once did, he would sternly but lovingly remind me, "Woman, you are not dumb. You had a brain tumor." He truly was more than just your standard husband. He genuinely lived out Ephesians 5:25, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." He did that. I had been seeing a counselor since about 9 months after my brain surgery. My goal with her was to help me come to an acceptance of the new life that had been thrust on me. Prior to my brain exploding, I had been educated, what I considered intelligent, independent, and lots of other things that my brain no longer allowed me to be. With God's help, my counselor, and the steadfast love of Roger, I had basically gotten to the point of acceptance of this new me. Then, the atomic bomb of all bombs exploded in my world. Monday, December 27th, 2021, started off like every other day. My love was still on vacation due to the holidays, but our daughter had to work. Daycare was closed, so we agreed to watch our granddaughter Sutton, who had just turned 1 a couple weeks prior. We went to the 8:30 a.m. class at our CrossFit gym, and we had just finished a workout. My 49-year-old, fit, healthy, and full of life husband finished and sat on the floor next to Sutton, she was sitting in her stroller watching us work out, when all of a sudden he lost consciousness. At first, Roger was just unconscious, but then he went into cardiac arrest. Luckily for us, one of the members at our gym is a nurse, and he started CPR while waiting the 15 minutes for the ambulance to arrive. Due to the times we live in now, COVID, I had very limited visitation with him in the hospital, and at least half of my conversation with his doctors took place on the phone. I quickly realized taking notes wasn't going to cut it because the doctors would talk so quickly that my broken brain didn't even have a chance to absorb what they had said enough to even put it on my phone to take notes. So many numbers, medicines, procedures, etc. Eventually, if I was in person, I would use a voice recording app, but if I was on the phone, I use an app that records phone calls. This helped me to be able to transcribe and pass the information on later to the Facebook group that I created to allow me to keep those up to date and that cared about him. It continues today, and it has nearly 600 members. I was faced with making a DNR, do not resuscitate, decision multiple times in those 12 days. The first time was when the doctor pulled me into the family conference room about an hour and a half to 2 hours into the saga. I'm sure this comes as no surprise to y'all, my fellow broken brain friends, that the idea of being solely responsible for these life and death choices when I myself relied on this strong man to help me through decisions was absolutely terrifying. Would I be able to absorb enough information to make the best, most informed choices that would honor this man that loved me so well for 31 years? Would my brain be able to handle or hold it together long enough to be by his side, come what may? It was in the earliest moments that I learned that God is truly near the brokenhearted, as he promised he is in Psalm 34:18. In these moments, somewhere I knew, without even a conscious thought, that God alone would be my strength. After all, there's absolutely nothing that can prepare you for the prospect of losing your husband at the age of 45. I can say without a shadow of a doubt that I have never felt God so close as he has been since December 27th. That first DNR conversation while Roger was in the trauma bay consisted of the doctor telling me the obvious: your husband is critically ill, but he's also young and in good health, so that will work in his favor. However, we know the likelihood of survival on subsequent revival attempts are slim to none, so if his heart stops again, do you want us to bring him back? In a former life, when we lived in Michigan, long before my brain became mushy, we were first responders on our local fire department for about 12 years. I also worked for an ambulance company as an EMT. I've seen death in many forms over the years. I also, rarely though, hearts stopped as young as my husband's under non-traumatic conditions. But my experience confirms for me what the doctor was saying. I knew I had better chances of winning millions in the lotto than getting my amazing husband back if his heart stopped again. Mercifully, thanks to my strong stomach and ability to not freak out, I was able to stay in the trauma bay. It was brutal what they were doing to him. I credit my years of disassociation in my EMS service to being able to not get myself kicked out, so I could be by his side as they intubated him, put IVs in what seemed like all available places, and so much more. I've intubated people myself, so I know how jarring it can look to the people that love the patient. I thank God for what felt like an ability to simultaneously watch what was happening to the person that I loved nearly all my life, but also not break down, which surely would have gotten me removed from the room. As I reflect, it almost feels like Jesus took on all the emotion of the moment onto himself so I could be there for this man that had never left my side. I praise God for his mercy. After so many tests, tubes, cords, in a few hours, we all rushed to the ICU. Knowing how cruel the visitation rules were, I made myself as small as possible to try and not be asked to leave. Miraculously, I was allowed to stay all night with him. I would learn later that the next day that it was only because they didn't expect him to survive the night. I was in a terribly uncomfortable chair, so as you'd imagine, I really didn't sleep. My brain issues are exponentially ramped up when lack of sleep, so this wasn't good, but I didn't care because if it meant being by his side, I would be willing to not sleep for days. Later that day, they kicked me out. That's when I learned why they had allowed me to stay. Y'all, I have a golf ball size hole in my frontal lobe, the part that is in charge of self-control. So you can imagine what I said to the nursing staff on my way out. I will say, though, that I didn't curse at them, and I made sure not to get myself arrested, but I was for sure expressed my extreme displeasure with the rules that I felt and still feel are crimes against humanity. This was Tuesday, December 28th. Wednesday started odd. They called and started the conversation with, "Ma'am, your husband is very strong." Happens that he pulled his ventilator out when they were out of the room, and they took that opportunity to test his brain function. He was able to tell them his name, and when asked, he said it was December 26th, which it was the 29th, but the 26th was the day before his cardiac arrest, so it was close enough. While overwhelmed with gratitude for this development, to say I was also devastated to not have been able to be there and hear his voice and share with him how much I loved him is an understatement. I wasn't allowed to be there with him, and that added incredible weight to an already crushing time. It also gave me enormous empathy for the scores of families that have faced this scenario over the past 2 years. What a difference several hours makes when you're critically ill, though. He would never speak again on this side of eternity. But I'm confident that at this very moment, he is praising God with the choirs of heaven. After this good news, we were cautiously celebrating. You can imagine the whiplash feeling when after dinner that same day, the hospital called to ask me to come in to see him because it was dire. It was so critical that when I asked them if I needed to bring our 3 kids, they said yes, and they are sticklers about the visitation rules. So this turned out to be the second time I would be faced with the dreaded DNR scenario. I rushed to his side with my kids following shortly behind me. We were basically there to say what we thought would be our see you laters, because I don't believe it's ever goodbye if we trust Jesus as our Savior, since one day we'll all be reunited with him, with each other in God's presence. My brain can't come up with a word to describe the heaviness of that moment. He was clearly in pain. The nurse informed me that all his organs were shutting down due to the trauma of being blood deprived on the gym floor during the cardiac arrest. They were going to start dialysis to try and help his kidneys, but they presented it as a type of Hail Mary attempt to save my baby's life. The nurse didn't really sound optimistic, though. When we get married and repeat the part in our vows of "till death do us part," we always assume that the parting will be when we're old and gray, after we'd spent a lifetime together. No one could ever imagine that when you'd be looking at your young spouse so full of life just a few days before and have to say your final parting words. It's truly unthinkable. What might you say if you were faced with that? I've learned a very invaluable lesson that I share as often as people will listen. We were a perfectly imperfect couple. However, I learned on December 29th that we had given each other one of the best gifts people can give one another, and we didn't even realize the gravity of it. I stood by his bed holding his extremely swollen hand, telling him how deeply I loved him, like I always did. What I realized was I didn't have anything profound to say in those what we thought would be the last moments together. I didn't have anything to apologize for. I didn't have anything I regretted that we hadn't long since forgiven each other for, or hadn't said in our previous 11,253 days we spent as a couple. I just thanked him for being the most amazing man, husband, father, grandfather, and best friend. I thanked him for taking such good care of me and giving me an incredible life. I just told him over and over how much I loved him, but that's what we did on the regular, many times a day. I didn't tell him a single thing he wasn't already aware of. I didn't realize until later how impactful that moment was. So often you hear about people saying they wish they had asked their loved ones to forgive them or needed to say things they hadn't said or whatnot. Because I didn't need tons of time alone with the one my heart adored, I was able to give his other family members a gift. We took time to call everyone we could think of that might want to say goodbye and give them a couple minutes to talk to him. We had no indication he could hear us, but I trust God that he made it to where Roger could hear whatever God wanted him to. One lesson I pray you take home from my story is to make every day count and always say what you need to say. I understand that not every relationship is salvageable, but we have tried to live according to Romans 12:18 that says, if possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with one another. For me, this includes telling those you love your feelings. You never know when you'll have a December 27th in your life. During that night, I couldn't shake the visual I'd seen, his jaundiced skin, his protruding eyeballs. I couldn't stop the panicked question, was I being selfish for allowing him to remain on life support when he was clearly suffering? I called his mom as well as his nurse. I prayed unceasingly and eventually landed on the fact that God will end this one way or another when he is ready, and that he is the only one that could love him more than me. What a comfort it is in times of this unimaginable horror that I serve a God that sees us and has only our best interests at heart. His timing is perfect and I can trust him. Well, lo and behold, the dialysis appeared to be doing its job. Not only did he survive the night, but he appeared to have rallied. He was starting to respond to the nurses by opening his eyes, etc. The doctors told me by phone, because I wasn't allowed to be there, that they've never seen anything like this situation. I wasn't surprised because clearly they hadn't met Team Shingledecker. This is something I've heard all of my life, like they've never seen anything like me. Truth be told, what they were seeing was God working out his perfect will, no matter how painful it was. This was Thursday, and I wouldn't be able to see him again until the weekend. And when I finally saw Roger, it was almost like seeing a different person. His color had returned to more of a normal color. His eyes ceased bulging, but one still was swollen with a scab on the iris, so it looked painful, but they said it would heal as he healed. For a couple days, when I would enter the room, immediately saying hello, or hello baby, or whatever I said, he would try to open his eyes, and you could just tell that he knew I was there. It was truly a gift, kind of like a lifeguard throwing out a life preserver to a drowning swimmer. I was only allowed 2-hour visits once a day. I couldn't break it into 2 1-hour visits, so we had a 2-hour date, as I called it. I would pull a chair next to his bed and hold his hand and talk to him. We would listen to music, worship music, read the Bible, and just share these moments together. Somehow, even though I earnestly joined people from around the globe in prayers for my partner's miraculous healing, I sensed that these were our last days together. It was as if he had one foot in heaven already. As painful as it was to see him languishing, I treasured every moment. I anguished because my brain issues have stolen so much from me, particularly in my precious memories. I don't remember our wedding day. I don't remember the birth of our babies or most things. Most memories I have aren't anything more than a photographic flash type thing. I heavily relied on this man that lay helplessly on the edge of eternity for my memories of how our life played out. Now, it was being threatened to be ripped from me. Would I remember how his touch felt, how his voice boomed? I wanted to take in every one of these awkward moments we had left in this ICU room. One day turned to 12 on this roller coaster. One day I'd get a call sounding more hopeful than one sounding concerned. I don't do well with uncertainty, and this journey was nothing but uncertainty. I would always preface a prognosis question with, I know you're not God, but what do you think? I guess this way I was hoping by acknowledging the obvious that I could cut through the CYA fluff that doctors love to add in these touchy situations. Sometimes it helped and others not so much, but every time they said, your husband is still very critical and this will be a long haul. I just find I do best when I have some sort of idea what I'm facing. Sometimes though, God only knows, and he forces us to walk by faith watching for the light that only he provides in a pitch black to guide the way. So I continued to take his hand to steady me and share the hope I had in his goodness with the people in the Facebook group and such. So I share the hope of his goodness no matter what the outcome of this dumpster fire was. I instinctively knew that no matter whether my love came home with me or he went to his forever home, he would win. What I didn't know was if he would remain here and how profound the ramifications of his health of this would be, the ramifications on his health this would be going forward, as well as the quality of life he faced, or if he'd go home to be with Jesus where he'd be in perfect health and wholeness. Fast forward to Friday, January 7th. I walked into chaos. His pulse was out of control, his blood pressure was low, they had his ventilator beyond maxed out, and they couldn't go any higher without risking the popping of the lung like an overinflated balloon. His low O2 had us rightfully concerned about brain damage, and there's only room for one brain damaged person in a marriage. He was in an unsustainable heart rhythm called atrial fibrillation, AFib for short. That was the same rhythm he was in at the gym. The activity in his room rivaled when he was first brought into the hospital 12 days prior. It was so dire, they ended up allowing me to be there for about 5 hours. They knew I wanted to talk to the doctor face to face, so I think they were turning a blind eye to me being there to allow that to happen. That, and I think we all knew that it wasn't good. He needed the miracle stat. You know it's going to be a hard conversation when the doctor takes you into a private room. It is a bit of a full circle moment because this was the same doctor who sat across from me in the ER family conference room and asked if I wanted to do life-saving measures on December 27th. That day, I had the sense I needed to make the same decision. I made it decisively on that Wednesday 29th when he looked like death. I signed the DNR that day, not with joy, of course, but with the knowledge that this was the right thing to do. When he rallied the next day and was looking better, I promptly revoked it. However, this was a different day. They were planning to do yet another round of dialysis for his ailing kidneys. This would be like the third or fourth in just under 2 weeks. How much more could this once strong and healthy body take? I didn't know, but I knew something needed to give. I expressed to the doctor that I had severe anxiety about the idea of signing another DNR. I couldn't figure out why. I knew if he went into cardiac arrest again, it wouldn't have a positive outcome, but why couldn't I just make that decision? Perhaps it was because I didn't want to have to look at my kids, my granddaughter, his mom, and others and have to say that I was the one that chose to end his life. I don't know. I just knew that I wanted to make the very best decision my broken brain could make for the one who had laid down his life for me for those 31 years. The doctor expressed that if my honey lived another week or so, we would have to have a discussion about his need for a feeding tube and tracheotomy, as well as other needs longer-term patients require. Talk about adding further stress to an already maxed out brain and heart. I knew that the idea of him languishing on life support, then all these extra measures, wasn't something that he would want if he could make the choice. And frankly, I wouldn't want that for him unless it meant that he would eventually recover as the Roger he would want to be. Knowing I didn't have the heart to make such a choice, we tabled the conversation for the day. I left with an extreme amount of heaviness, much like I had the evening I first had to say see you later to the man of my man of 31 years. I called our pastor to talk to him. I just remember expressing to him how weary I was of watching the one I love suffer so much. Sure, he was on tons of sedatives, paralytics, and some pain medicine, but no one could convince me that he wasn't miserable. With a newly added, very real chance of brain damage and irreversible damage to other vital organs, I just knew that the likelihood of him being able to get back to some semblance of life, of the life that he loved, was fading with the passing of every hour. We talked about how desperately I want him home with me. I mean, we had a 30th anniversary to celebrate, which was yesterday, as well as he would turn 50 on September 30th. Our beautiful granddaughter needed her very first BFF to play with. I needed my brain caretaker, my very best friend. The conversation landed on the same place it had in the last 12 days. God alone is the giver and taker of life. In Job 14:5, we are told this about God. You have decided the length of our lives. You know how many months we will live, and we are not given a minute longer. The fact that God knew when he formed Roger in his mother's womb the exact second his heart would cease to beat permanently, and not one thing I could do would change that plan, would be my comfort from the start and quell any regrets that may start to pop up after, including now. So we prayed together on that familiar ride home and left it in the hands of our merciful God, who was the only one who could love Roger more than I did. Fast forward an hour or so, I had just written a very lengthy update to the Facebook group and was proofreading it when my phone rang. I looked at the familiar name on the caller ID I had grown used to seeing, but this time I had a sinking feeling. When I answered, they told me in a firm voice that I needed to get there immediately, and they asked how long it would take. They informed me that the one I had loved for as long as my memory goes back, the one I stood at the altar and pledged until death do us part, his heart had ceased beating again, and they needed me there as quickly as possible. I had this inexplicable calm, yet I started shaking mildly. I gathered my kids. I somehow managed to get out the door and began calling everyone that needed to know, starting with his mom. I remember the traffic being unbelievably slow for 8 p.m. on a Friday. Of course, it was probably normal speed, but nothing would be fast enough as long as you were in front of me in the way of getting to the hospital to be by his side. I knew in my heart that this was the official end of the road here on earth for this incredible man. I knew that even as I drove to make decisions, I hold his hand and tell him I loved him one more time, that in that moment his heart had stopped, that Jesus, the one that saved his soul, had already met him and walked him into paradise. When I arrived, they escorted me to his room, such a flurry of activity. The doctor that I had just saw 2 hours prior, that I had spoken to about not wanting to make a final decision, looked at me as they were doing CPR and told me what my heart already knew, that it was over. However, they needed me, the one allowed to make the final choice, to approve them stopping the heroic efforts. In reality, there really wasn't a choice to be made. They had been doing CPR for about 20 minutes or so and still hadn't gotten any rhythm back. So all that was needed was for me to concur. When I told the doctor I agreed with his assessment, all the activity ceased. At 8:21 p.m. on Friday, January 7th, 2022, Roger Allen Shingeldecker had officially, by the law's standards, ceased to live here on earth. As far as the law was concerned, I officially switched from being his wife to his widow. However, I am confident that by that time, he had already been ushered into the presence of perfection, holiness, and glory so divine that I bet this normally reserved man fell flat on his face and worshiped. Or maybe Jesus took him by his nail-pierced hands and showed him around his forever home. I can't know until I join them. I do know, according to Scripture, that he was without any of the physical ailments of the previous 12 days, or 49 years for that matter. The only one with any scars in heaven is the one that brought him into paradise. I stood there once again, telling him how very much I loved him, thanking him for the beautiful life we had. I told him how jealous of him I was that he was now in glory because I had made the deal that I was the one going first. Clearly, God is not on board with my deals. And I wondered aloud what he must be seeing and all the sights and sounds he was probably taking in. I asked him to say hello to Jesus and my beloved grandparents for me, and I told him that I would see him soon, while assuring him that I would be okay. Mercifully, all his suffering had ceased. The doctor looked at me and said, and I do not think he's a believer, he said, maybe this was his final gift to you, not having to make the DNR choice. And I was so grateful. Until December 27th, I would have said my brain tumor, relearning to walk, and all the issues that brought with it, as well as my compounding 2 other brain injuries, was the worst thing that I'd ever been through. And it was true until that point, till December 27th. This hard, however, is the hardest of hard. As I stand here, I still can't believe this is my life. Conversely, though, it is the searing loss that allows me to stand here and tell you that there truly is hope after everything you face. My prayer is that you will find that hope if you haven't already. My hope in this hard life in eternity has a name, and it's Jesus. Thank you for having me.